Today's talk is entitled Hamas, Gaza, and the War, Insights from the Past and Present, to be delivered by Dr. Stephen Lloyd Moffett. Stephen Lloyd Moffett has run the religious program at Cal Poly for the last 18 years, where he has tried to inspire students to uncover their neighbor, to understand their neighbor. You're busted, buddy. All right. Now let's start this over. During that time, he has also given over 250 public lectures in the country, composed 25 opinion pieces for the San Luis Obispo Tribune, written 3 books, a dozen articles, and is a frequent voice on local public radio. His nonprofit, the Lavra Community, welcomes more than 1,000 people a year to its farm for education and community building. In his free time, he likes to creatively build houses and make wine. Oh, and UC Cambria is one of his favorite places to visit. Stephen, would you please come up and say hello, ladies and gentlemen? Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks so much, everybody, for showing up. My original topic was girl boss gurus, which would have been a little bit more fun, but as so often happens, the real world comes in and affects us in deep ways. And I think the second reading really captures the emotion behind this conflict and what we're seeing in the news. And I always tell my students that we shouldn't pretend like those emotions aren't important. They really are important, and we need to sort of sit with those emotions and feel them. But we also need to sort of understand. When I started religious studies at Cal Poly, we came up with this motto that understanding leads to convivencia. Convivencia was the period when Jews, Muslims, and Christians got along in Spain in a way that encouraged each other, and that leads to peace. And we've always had in our motto, peace in Arabic and in Hebrew. But what we're trying to say is that the road to peace begins with understanding. And so today is a lot about understanding. This is going to be less the inspirational talk or the, curious spiritual talk, and more the entire conflict up to the present in 25 minutes. And I will begin with just sort of my own background here. I lived in Israel in 1994. I was doing my research studying Orthodox monks. I was not really on either side of this conflict at the time, but the conflict came to me. I would escape the monastery from time to time to go to Tel Aviv to go out with friends and see a movie. And the first movie I saw happened to be in the afternoon at a theater, and a block away was the first big bus bomb that Hamas set out. And because I was in a movie, I didn't hear the bomb, but I walked out on it. And ironically, if you know the movie was Speed, which is about a bomb being on a bus. So the reality of this really came home to me. I went on to study Christianity, Judaism, and Islam in grad school. And then when I came to Cal Poly, I've co-taught a class on religion and politics in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict ever since 2007. And I'll be teaching it again next quarter. So, I love that first reading because it seems like the children of Abraham should get along. It seems like that they all share a common God, a common base set of scriptures. Why is it that they tend to cause so much conflict? And how does that play out here? So let's begin at the beginning. So both groups, neither the Palestinians nor the Israelis are indigenous to the land of Canaan. Both groups came around the same time, around 1200 BCE. So some people say, oh, you should just give it back to the originals. We should give it back to the Canaanites. Unfortunately, the Canaanites aren't around anymore to give it back to. But they both settled in the land of Canaan at the same time. Eventually, the Jews created the country of Israel. And for about the next 1,000 years, there was something like the country of Israel in the land. It was filled with turmoil. It was filled with internal strife, but there was something similar to the land of Israel at that time. The promise of the great godly nation of Israel was challenged a lot when the Babylonians, particularly in 587, destroyed it. And then afterwards, there was a series of persecutions with non-Israelites at the kingdom, bringing up to the Romans who conquer the land in 63 BCE. Now, like other occupiers, the Israelites wanted their own nation back, and they would continually revolt. The most famous of which is the revolt of 66-70, in which the temple in Jerusalem burned. But the most important for us is the Bar Kokhba revolt in 132. This was a time when the Jews came together under a Messiah figure, Simon Bar Kokhba. Almost all Jews embraced him, and they overthrew the Romans and lived as an independent nation for a few years. But as with everybody who tries to overthrow the Romans weren't happy about that and got their vengeance. And the vengeance here was to kick all the Jews out of their land in which they had lived for about the last 1,200 years. They banned the name Israel, and the Romans decided to call this now Palestine, after the Philistine area that was the indigenous group near Gaza. So this begins the diaspora. So from 135 to the 19th century, Jews weren't in large numbers in their traditional lands. They were in lands that were far from their historical area, mostly in Spain, Northern Africa, and then the Ashkenazi Jews in North Central Europe. Now, in each time as they lived in this diaspora, they were not allowed to be citizens. And so they often were kicked out and persecuted in their land. They were also not allowed to be part of government in that sense. Not part of government, but they also played a negative role in the story of the majority, which the majority in most of the lands in which they lived were Christians, and the Christians of all ilk, Orthodox, Catholic, and Protestant, all would at a variety of times persecute them when things weren't going well in their life. So where does modern Israel come from? Well, to understand modern Israel, you have to go back to the rise of nationalism in the 18th and 19th century. This was the idea that no longer were we going to live under kingdoms or fiefdoms. We were going to have nations. And what would bring these nations together? Well, that wasn't always clear, but it was often a common history, a common language, something like that. And so you see the rise of France, you see the rise of the United States, you see the rise of a united Germany, things like that. And Jews began to say, well, if America can exist as a nation with no shared history, no common language, no even common beliefs, and yet they get a nation, shouldn't we have a nation too? I mean, after all, we have a long-standing and clear history. We have a shared experience. We need a Jewish state. And the Jewish state, this movement towards a Jewish state somewhere in the world was called Zionism. And this is important because Zionism just means there should be one place in the world in which Jews are not persecuted, where they can control their destiny. And the argument was there are many different Christian nations in the world. There are many different Muslim nations in the world. Why can't there be one state where Jews can have a safe harbor? Now, this idea of nationalism really comes up with Theodor Herzl, 1897. You see the first Zionist conference. And there was talk of it being in the traditional homeland of ancient Israel that had been renamed Palestine. But there was also talk of it being in Argentina. There's even talk of trying to carve out a piece of Montana. I mean, it wasn't necessarily in that spot, even though that was probably the most logical spot. Many Jews did not support Zionism in this form. The more Orthodox Jews, the more traditional Jews said this is a human-driven endeavor, and if God wants us to have a state, God should provide the state. And then a lot of more reform-minded Jews were like, well, we've lived for the last 1,800 years amidst non-Jews, and we have inspired and grew and fulfilled our role there. If God wanted us to have a state, don't you think he would have sort of done that already? And so really Zionism didn't have widespread belief, widespread support at the 19th century. The Holocaust or Shoah. So the Holocaust is still used in academic circles for the events of World War II. But in Jewish circles, a Holocaust means a sacrifice for past sins. And so Jews starting around the 1960s said, is this the right term to describe what happened to us in World War II? No, we should call it Shoah, which means the catastrophe. So Jews began to refer to what secular and academics call the Holocaust as Shoah. So if there was any debate about whether Jews needed a place to be free of persecution, Shoah squashed that debate. All Jews said, okay, the tea leaves are clear here. We need some place in the world to be free of persecution, to control our own destiny. If every other religion gets to have a spot, so do we, given our unique history. So what happens? They declare independence because the UN says, yes, we are reshuffling the deck of world powers at this moment. The British, who had controlled the area of Israel-Palestine ever since the Ottoman Empire, were wanting to divest of that area. And so the UN said, yes, you can have your state. And they created an original plan in which the population living there, the Palestinians, would have one part, the Jews and presumably many immigrant Jews would come in, and then the city of Jerusalem would be under international control. So let's switch to the other side. The Palestinians were those who remained in the newly named area of Palestine after the Romans kicked the Jews out in 135. Originally, they were pagan, as all Romans were. As Romans became Christians, they became Christians. And then after many of the Christians in that area converted to Islam as Islam spread. But the Palestinians have always been a mix of Christians and Muslims. And when you look at about 1900, it's about 75% Muslim, about 25% Christian. So there's always been this mix. They were a part of the Ottoman Empire, which had lasted for many centuries, so sort of a region. And they had a distinct identity, but it was a little bit like we might say Texas has a distinct identity in the United States. Yes, they sometimes want to claim that they're independent and, not, but we just recognize they're a sector of the U.S. When the Ottomans chose the wrong side in World War I, they lose that land, and the British take over. The French are north in Syria and Lebanon, and the British are over that area. But the British were never terribly happy being in power in that area because there's just not a lot of resources for them and a lot of conflict that they were having to navigate. So let's bring them up to 1947. The international community says Jews can have a land here. The Palestinians say, okay, I can acknowledge that the Germans really mistreated the Jewish population of Europe. Fair enough. Why don't you give them Germany? Why take our land? Like, what did we do? Why do we have to bear the loss of our land because the Germans did something? And so and the international community said, well, we're not taking all your land. And the Palestinians were like, well, we shouldn't have to give any of our land up. We're not the ones who caused the harm. And so the Palestinians, supported by the Arab nations around them, said, no, hell no. And we are going to fight. And this is the first Arab-Israeli war. Now, what happened? The Arab nations that were supporting the Palestinian people, now had all been Ottomans, a few decades before, sniped at each other as much as they sniped at the original Israeli armies. They were very not united. They did not support each other. There's a very famous spot where the Jordanians are closing in on one side, and they send a secret message to Israel. They say, give Gaza to God, the devil, or take it yourselves. Whatever you do, don't give it to the Egyptians. In other words, they had such rivalries that they fought extremely poorly, and the Palestinians lost. This, in Palestinian lore, it's called the Nakba, which is the catastrophe, which, if you'll note, Shoah, the catastrophe, Jewish catastrophe, led to the Palestinian catastrophe. So Israel was founded in 1948, and it starts off with this beautiful vision because many of its founders had experienced the horrors of Europe in World War II, and they said, we are going to do things differently. We are going to learn from the mistakes of the past. They developed a whole new way of living, the kibbutz life, which is a sort of commune dedicated to collective living. They promised to create an enlightened state, and they chose the Star of David as their symbol because he was the enlightened king. He was the one who upheld the highest values of what it meant to be a godly nation. But Arabs weren't always happy having lost in 1948. And so at different times over the next few decades, they regroup to sort of avenge their loss from 1948-49. The most famous regrouping was in 1967, when the Arabs finally unite and say, we will avenge our loss in 48-49 and kick the Jews into the sea. What happens, though, is Israel gets word of this attack coming, and they preemptively strike all the Arab neighbors and destroy the air force, essentially destroy the air force of all the Arabs all in one morning. And when you control the air on a flat desert ground, you control the battlefield. And in 6 days, they tripled the size of their nations. Now, military historians will say this is one of the great military victories of all time, but it also changed the equation for how Israel saw itself. And let me sort of break this down. So, Israel had always hoped to be a Jewish nation, Jewish identity, democratic in style, and the full size of ancient Israel. Well, after 47, they were a Jewish nation, democratic in style, but they never controlled what we might call as the biblical heartland. This is where most of the biblical stories happen, the West Bank. And so they did not have sea from 1948 to 1967. The war in 1967 gave them the West Bank, the biblical heartland. They were in control of it. They also got Sinai, which they didn't really care about, and the Golan Heights, but this restored the entire of ancient Israel. But in that biblical heartland were tons of Palestinians, many Palestinians who did not share their Jewish faith. And so there was no way to have all three of these. And so the central dilemma is, if you want to be a Jewish nation in the full size of ancient Israel, you can't be democratic because there's just too many non-Jewish Palestinians who are voting. If you want to be democratic in style and the full size of ancient Israel, you won't end up being Jewish. And if you want to be Jewish and the full size of ancient Israel, you can't be democratic. And this is the basic dilemma that Israel has faced since 1967. They have three axioms that they've always wanted to uphold, and there's no way of doing it given the current configuration. So 1967. They control the land of the West Bank. They occupy that land, but they have never incorporated it fully into Israel. So what happens in the next 20 years? Well, I want to mark one event where the Arabs came together once again to avenge their loss of 67, which was the attempt to avenge their loss of 47. And this was on October 6, 1973, when they surprise attacked the Israelis on Yom Kippur, one of the holiest days of the year. It ended up, in some ways, it was a savvy military move because the defenses were at the weakest on the holy day. Also, though, it ended up being sort of backfiring because all Israelis were in synagogue, so it wasn't hard to tell everybody to go get their uniforms and start fighting. But it was a day in which the Arabs actually had some limited success, and America ends up bailing out Israel in the subsequent battle. But remember that date, October 6th. So what happens in the next 20 years? Well, there's three basic positions that Palestinians and Israelis hold. One position is integration that says, hey, look, we are all children of Abraham. We are all, in some version, part of this homeland. Let's integrate with one another and live together as one nation. The other says, well, we may not be brothers and co-workers and stuff, but we can we can sort of coexist, trade with one another, keep some degree of separation. And the third says, no, we need firm boundaries to separate at all times. And so there's always been a tension between those three factions on both sides. Those who really want to integrate, create a higher unity, one who says, okay, we can trade, we can be together, and others say we need firm boundaries. And then there were a whole series of attempts at peace, usually brokered by the US. But every time there was a peace, there would always be a faction who wanted to scuttle that peace, who said, no, peace requires us to compromise on both sides. We should not have to compromise. The Palestinians, from the Palestinian side, this was our land and it was taken from us because something the Germans did. We don't have to give anything back. From the Israeli side, this is our land. God gave it to us. We don't need to share it with anybody. So what tended to happen is every time there was a movement towards peace, there would be a group who tried to scuttle that peace. In political science, we call that the extremist veto. That is, extremes can veto the will of the majority by trying to sabotage it, trying to get the groups to say that peace was not worth it. Now, the most important one was the Oslo Accords of the 1990s. This was the first time where Yasser Arafat actually began the process of, was the Palestinian leader, began the process saying, let's try to create some lasting peace. And it was a triumph of the practical realists. Neither side was getting what they want, but they were on the path to creating peace. Yet there was always this faction that wanted to scuttle it, to make sure that there was no compromise. I like to call them absolute idealists because they are saying, here's what's right, and we'll fight for that. On the Israeli side, there were many examples of the extremist veto, including Yitzhak Rabin, the one who negotiated the peace, gets assassinated by a synagogue student. You see a massacre in a mosque by actually an American Jew who's living there. And then Ariel Sharon, who was one of the great generals of Israel, deliberately would make these provocative visits to the second holiest spot or third holiest spot in Islam, the Dome on the Rock, to try to sort of incite a response. But the most sort of deliberate attempt to scuttle along this journey towards peace was the rise of settlements. That is, a extremist Jewish group would drive into the West Bank, which is filled with Palestinians, find a hilltop and say, God has given us this hilltop, we will take it forever. They knew that the Palestinians would say, wait, this is our land. We've been farming it for hundreds of years. They would react, in which case the Israeli Defense Force, the Israeli government says, well, even if we don't agree with them, they're citizens and we need to keep them safe. And so then we put these barriers around these places. Then you divide up the West Bank and then that makes people more happy. And for the settlers, this is what they want. They want to scuttle the peace process, have Israel annex the West Bank and just have it part of Israel. So there have been absolute idealists on the Israeli side that have really tried to scuttle the peace. On the Palestinian side, this is what this is why Hamas started. Hamas started as an extremist group to scuttle any peace process. In their charter, they said, we want to remove all Jews from the land. We should not have a Jew in this land. This is Palestinian land. We are Muslim and maybe tolerant of a few Christians, but our primary goal is to make sure peace never happens and that we will ultimately be victorious. Now, there was a first rising up of Palestinians to try to break the peace. That's the first Intifada. Intifada is a Arabic word for, it's when when a dog gets wet and sort of shakes off all the water. That's Intifada. It was their attempt to shake off the Israelis. But the most potent was the second Intifada in the early 2000s, where they went into Israel with suicide bombs and targeted this one pizza place got targeted 3 times. They targeted kids' bar mitzvahs. They targeted just the softest targets to try to create an environment in which Israelis said, no, we don't want peace, and reacted against them so that Palestinians would rise up. We don't want peace. The whole idea of suicide bombing was to make both sides hate each other so that there could not be peace. So then the absolutist wins out. So Hamas were an extremist veto group who wanted to use tactics to try to ensure that any sort of compromise would never be successful by stimulating the worst part of human nature in response to each other. Okay. The basic structure, though, of the peace plans have always been, we will return land to Arab or Palestinians in return for peace. This was the Egypt-Israeli peace in 1979. But then in 2005, the Israeli prime minister said, we're going to follow this model and we are going to unilaterally give Gaza, this sort of part of that they gained in 1967, back to the Palestinians. Now, from an Israeli perspective, Gaza is not important biblically. It doesn't have a lot of resources, so it wasn't actually much to give up, even if there were Israelis living there who were unhappy. But they said, fine, here, have Gaza. Show us that you want to be a nation that can coexist side by side. So what happens? In 2006, there's an election. President Bush, actually, I'm going to go back. President Bush embraced this notion of the democratic peace, that 2 democracies have hardly ever gone to war against each other. So if we encourage democracy, that will bring peace. And so he says, Palestinians, you guys should have an election. They have an election and Hamas wins. And the US government was like, no, we don't want that democratic result. You picked wrong, Palestinians. And there's some misperception. It wasn't largely about Hamas's anti-Israel stake. It was really a referendum on how corrupt Yasser Arafat and his sort of long-standing Palestinian regime was. So what happens? They isolate this Hamas, and you end up with a Palestinian civil war between Hamas, this area, this extremist veto group, and Fatah, which is the Palestinian Authority. This was the group that Yasser Arafat started, tended to be more secular, and it was centered on the West Bank. And so in 2007, there's almost 1,000 Palestinian deaths by other Palestinians. I mean, it's a brutal civil war. There's also another group, Islamic Jihad, which was never had intentions to be a government, but were very much a radical group in the north. And they're all fighting each other, and it's just chaos. But the result of the civil war is Hamas is in total control of Gaza. The Palestinian Authority, Fatah, Fatah is the political wing of the Palestinian Authority, they're in control of the West Bank. That's the biblical heartland occupied by Israel still. Remember, Gaza had been given back to the Palestinians. And then Islamic Jihad is kind of sprinkled in there. So what happens? Well, Israel says, look, if Hamas, this group that is publicly proclaimed to have no Jews living in the area as part of their charter, and it's an extremely anti-Semitic charter. It quotes the Protocols of Zion, if you know that. I mean, it's cringy. They're not far away from our population center. So if you want to go Gaza to Tel Aviv, it's slow to Santa Maria. I mean, that's how big an area we're talking. and almost the same from the 101 to the ocean. I mean, it is just a tiny area. And so Israel says, fine, you guys have elected a group that wants us destroyed and you're 30 miles away. We will ensure that you never have the resources to be able to destroy us as you publicly proclaimed. So that was the goal of the blockade. A blockade only works when you control all sides. And so the southern border is controlled by Egypt. So the fate of Egypt has always played a role in this. Now, here's the important thing. Egypt, not to do an entire history of Egypt, but modern Egypt has been the story of a Western-leaning group and a more Islamist group called the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood had wanted to overthrow the kind of secular Western leanings ever since 1929, and they have been the thorn of every single leadership in Egypt since 1929. Hamas is the Muslim Brotherhood in Palestine. That's who they modeled themselves off. And so as long as the Egyptians are in power, the sort of the traditional Egyptian power structures are in power, they were very happy to keep the blockade because that punished Hamas, who was aligned with the enemy of that. Now, there was 1 year in which the Muslim Brotherhood ruled in Egypt, and there was no more blockade because everything went through, but that didn't last, and we can't get into all of Egyptian history. But I want to bring one other element that becomes important. The Israeli government also saw the blockade as punishing or as resulting in the citizens of Gaza struggling because they couldn't get basic goods in. And for the Israeli government, this meant this would inspire them to rise up against Hamas, that their life would become so bad that they would say no to Hamas. Furthermore, so there was this sort of structural attempt to actually create poor living conditions in Gaza, thinking that that would inspire the people to rise up against their power. So why did October the 6th happen? Well, whenever you think about this conflict, you always think there's three options at any given day: peace, the status quo, or war. And peace happens when it's a better option than the status quo or war. War happens when it's a better option than peace or the status quo, and status quo happens when that's better than the other. So we need to sort of look at it as what affects the decision to turn to war. There are both internal factors that push one towards war. That can be, politics. This could be economy, things like that. And then there's external factors. Things like U.S. elections play a big role. Arab Spring, things like that. So let's look at why did this happen in October 6th, October 7th, and the declaration of war. Like, what was Hamas thinking when they prompted this latest round of attacks? I hopefully don't need to share the gruesome details of this day, but it was a day where Hamas surprised the Israeli Defense Forces and infiltrated from Gaza. Over 1,000 troops, it looks like, or 1,000 individuals came in, and a number of everyday citizens as well. And they targeted particularly the kibbutz communities in the south. I have several friends who were in those kibbutzes, and one kibbutz of a friend of mine lost 120 people just in their one community. And then one of the worst parts of it was attacking a music festival in which hundreds of Israelis, young Israelis, were dancing away until they never danced again. So what motivated Hamas to do this October 7th? Well, this isn't the first time Hamas has provoked a uptick in hostilities. We've seen it 4 different times prior to this time. This was certainly the most intense of them, but they've done this before, and we have learned about why they choose to do it. Because on any given day, they could keep the status quo, they could say, I want to turn to peace, or they could go to war. Why have they chosen to go to war? So I'm going to mention 5 reasons. If you understand the Hamas strategy, Hamas's strategy is not to win militarily. They will never have the capability to take on Israel. Israel has one of the most advanced armies in the world. They have some of the most advanced systems. There is no path to military victory for Hamas. What is their path to have their own ability to control their destiny? Their only path is for the international community to put pressure on Israel to give autonomy to Palestine. That is the only path that Hamas has to reach their goals. But what has happened over the last decade? Well, if you look at the early 2000s, if you just look at the New York Times or any major publication, there were stories about the Israel-Palestine conflict on every edition, often on the front page. Over time, though, the conflict has kind of receded. You just see less and less articles. I mean, it used to be 2 Palestinians dead or 1 Israeli dead. Oh, that's front page news. Now, it's not even in the news anymore. It's just the international community is kind of tired of it. They're frustrated with Netanyahu, who has been in power since 2009, almost consistently, and prior to that. But he doesn't seem to want peace. The Palestinians, democracy, and then civil war, and the international community is just like, and so international fatigue had set in. And if you look at why you do a terrorist attack, it's a way of saying, pay attention, because you can't not look. You can't just say, 1,000 people slaughtered. No, you begin to discuss it. So Hamas's plan was to create something so horrific that the international community had to pay attention again, had to get back into the game. They couldn't just wash their hands of the conflict and say, you guys just kill each other. You guys work things out because there's no hope here. Now, what they hoped was this horrific event of October 6th, 7th would then quickly fade, and the international community would just talk about Palestinian suffering. I mean, that's what they hope, right? This provokes the conversation. The world community says, hey, well, why did this happen? Let's go back and talk about it. So it was a last-ditch attempt to get the international community to come and re-examine the conflict again, with the hope that sympathy for the Palestinians would lead to international pressure on Israel to give autonomy to the Palestinians. So they needed to get back in the headlines. And the only way to do that now was through a massive terrorist attack. Second of all, internally, Hamas has been a disaster of a government. Now, Hamas will say that's because we've been under blockade for the last 17 years or whatever it is. So we haven't been able to provide the goods. But it's fair to say that that they've failed in doing the basics. That is trash service, consistent power, hospitals, schools. They have not been good at that. But what happens is, and there's been a lot of polling in Gaza, is every time the polling went down, if you look at this, the circles are each time they started a war. Well, there's always been a rally around the flag effect. That is, when people are frustrated with their own government, let's provoke a war, and then everybody unites for a while. And I think the greatest example of this principle is Israel. Israel, as we'll see, was the most divided ever on October 5th. Never in the history of Israel has it been so divided. By October 8th, they were all united suddenly. And so the idea is, when you're facing an external combatant, people retrench back to unity. And so Hamas wanted the unity because they were in their worst spot they had ever had. For the first time this past summer, everyday Gazans were rising up and they were protesting against the Hamas government. There was a lot of articles of just how corrupt they were. Most of the leadership of Hamas is living in Qatar or in Turkey. They're not even there. And it's just there's just so much corruption that they were really losing the support of their people. So they needed something to rally them. Third of all, Hamas arose at the beginning of the Oslo Accords as the face of resistance. The people who said, no, we will not compromise. We will always fight for 100% Palestinian land. Well, the reality is the last 3 or 4 years, they haven't really done much. They've really been kind of struggling internally. But what has risen is this other group, Islamic Jihad. Islamic Jihad were a little bit scattered throughout the last 30 years. They had some people, but somehow in the last 2 years, they got new uniforms, they got new structure, they became very effective against the IDF, that's the Israeli Defense Force, and all the IDF attention went to Islamic Jihad. And Hamas is going over there in Gaza going, wait, no, we're the face of resistance. We're the ones, they're pretenders, Islamic Jihad. We've been doing this for 25 years. And so they needed something to reclaim the mantle of the face of Israeli aggression and have people stop talking about this rival group, Islamic Jihad. Fourth of all, one of the good things Trump did, weird to say that out loud, is to try to get Arab nations to normalize relations with Israel. Because remember, Hamas says Israel has no right to exist. It should cease to be a country. There is no compromising with an unjust beginning. Well, when the United Arab Emirates or other Arab nations begin to recognize Israel, they undercut Hamas's narrative. And so the Trump administration begins the Abraham Accords, trying to get Arab nations. And I mean, to be honest, basically what we did is we'll give you a ton of money and access to the US markets in return for you recognizing Israel. Fine. But the big kahuna in the Abraham Accords is Saudi Arabia. Because Saudi Arabia isn't the largest Islamic nation by a large spot, but it is symbolically the most important of the Islamic nations. If Saudi Arabia recognizes Israel and normalizes the relationship, that provides cover for many, many other Islamic nations to do it. I mean, if you are like, hey, I want access to US markets, I want to trade with Israel, but I don't want to be it. Well, if you can just say Saudi Arabia did it, man, it will be a cascading effect. The whole Middle East will change if Saudi Arabia does this. And Biden has been working the last 2 years to make this happen and negotiating and making promises to Saudi Arabia saying, hey, recognize Israel and we will change everything about how the US deals with Saudi Arabia. And the rumor was October was going to be the month. October was going to be the month that Saudi Arabia normalized relationships. So Hamas said, we need to undercut this before it happens. We need to get on there because it's very hard for Saudi Arabia to normalize relationships when there's 10,000 innocent people dying in Gaza. Even if they understand the big picture, that's not an image that they want to be connected with. And so Hamas had to scuttle this plan because otherwise they were going to be isolated in the Islamic world. And by the way, it looks like they were successful in that. Finally, as I mentioned, Israel was at its weakest spot ever. Netanyahu had somehow managed to pull the rabbit out of the hat again and get elected. He was making calls for dramatic reforms. It was dividing Israel. And here's the important part. Almost every adult is a part of the Israeli Defense Force reserves. And what you saw is so many people in Israel were troubled by Netanyahu's reforms that they were refusing to show up for the reserve training. They were refusing to be a part of the defense. Hamas, which is always looking for a vulnerability, was like, man, this is the most vulnerable they've ever been simply because you have units where people just won't even speak to one another, try to navigate a war if you're so divided on it. So 5 reasons Hamas attacks on October 7th was to return attention, to try to get it on the headlines again, to rally public support, to bolster their internal numbers, to reassert themselves as the face of Israeli resistance, to sabotage the path of Saudi Israeli normalization, and to exploit Israel's spot. So what's next? Well, people are like, oh man, who could have seen this horror happening? Well, Hamas wants a ground invasion. That is the whole point. Because remember, Hamas needs sympathy, and sympathy comes from tragedy. And so this is not some wow, I can't believe Israel did it. This is what Hamas wants. They want a horrific ground campaign, and they want to have everyone in the world know about every child that is that is a casualty of this conflict, because their whole strategy is to get world opinion to be strong enough so that the world community puts pressure on Israel. So what does Israel want to do? Well, there is a part of vengeance on this and retribution. They're like, hey, look, you took 1,000 of our innocent people. You lost the moral high ground, Hamas. But they also want to bring the kidnapped Israelis back. This has always been a part of it. If you go back just not a few years ago, they traded 1,000 Palestinian prisoners for one IDF soldier that Hamas was holding. So they have set the precedent that they're willing to give a ton to get their people back. But most of all, they want to contain Hamas's attack capabilities. There was a huge debate over the last 5 years of whether Hamas was mainstreaming. Were they going to be a normal political party and stop being this sort of extremist veto? Well, that debate's done. Like, no one's advocating that Hamas is moving towards being a legitimate broker for peace. And so Israel just says, we need to eliminate them because there is no Hamas that is a partner for peace now. Now, they will say eliminate Hamas. They can't eliminate Hamas because Hamas runs the schools, they run the post office, they run the hospitals, they run everything. So you can't eliminate Hamas completely, and nor should you. I mean, the poor school teacher isn't the Hamas leadership, even though technically they're part of Hamas. But they need to try to eliminate the capability of the Hamas leadership to just do this again, because this is the 5th time in 13 years. Fine. And then they need to remind, since they also have Hezbollah against them and they have Islamic Jihad, they have Syrian factions against them, they need to remind the world community or their regional community that they're tough, because the perception, because of the Netanyahu revolts, is that they are weak. So they want to do that. But they also operate in a context of anti-Semitism, a huge spike in anti-Semitism around the world. So they're sort of saying, look, yeah, people are pissed off at us. Well, look, it's not hard to understand why. People have been unfair to Jews for millennia. And so the context is a spike of it. They also are very sensitive to the double standard. Jews have always been sensitive to this, but they point out after 9/11, America killed between 480,000 and 500,000 innocent people after 9/11. Well, if you look at the proportion of the attack of 9/11 to the population of the US, the October 7th attacks were 10, 15 times what it was, and yet people are griping over a few thousand civilians dying. Like, that's a double standard. Like, if the world community said America had a right to gain vengeance, to reestablish safety, why do Jews not have that right after it? So they're in a context of a very perceived double standard. The Hamas wants to gain sympathy, scuttle the talks, create a rally on the flag, as we said. But that's why it's important to say that when people talk about human shields, this is very deliberate from Hamas, because if Hamas fighters die, there's not much international sympathy, right? Soldiers die. When innocent Palestinians die, that's what spikes sympathy, because that's tragedy. So they're not human shields because they're not there to protect the leadership. They're human sacrifices. They want those people to die so people are sympathetic towards the cause and put pressure on Israel. And so they are not sort of, well, their tears are crocodile tears for these folks, because this is what their strategy depends upon. They need innocent deaths in order to get the sympathy to put the international pressure on it. Plus, fighting the Israeli Defense Forces is never going to be a winning game for them unless they are fighting in an urban area where they have been planning for the fight for more than a decade. That's the only place they have a chance. And so they wanted the Israeli Defense Force to come into Gaza, to come into their trap, and to lose IDF forces. So that's Hamas's goal. So what's going to happen? Well, right now, both sides need war. Netanyahu needs war to rally people around him. He needs war to show that he's tough. His whole platform the last 2 decades have been, I'm the one who will keep you safe. And that narrative was largely dismantled on October 7th. So he needs to reestablish that. So he has no incentive to make this quick. Notice also who doesn't have incentive to make it quick? Hamas. Hamas needs this to be as horrific a war as they can possibly have, because they need to have enough international sympathy for the community for the international community to put pressure on Israel enough to get autonomy. So I just don't think it ends anytime soon in any civilized way. It's going to be a very sad, sad winter. But here's what I tell my students is, look, this is a super complex issue. There are so many different layers to try and understand it. But basically, if it can fit on a protest sign, you've simplified it too much. Like, we need to move beyond the slogans. We need to try to understand the different perspectives and recognize that there isn't just one Palestinian perspective. There's not one Israeli perspective. There are many, many different perspectives. And we need to try to educate ourselves on them. Because in the end, I think, if we really want to have peace, so I want to go back to our original motto, that it begins with an attempt to heartfully understand others, to try to get at what's motivating them, then to build a place where we can coexist with each other, and then peace happens. And I think it means, most of all, trying to see the other side in the best light we can. I would have said 20 years ago, I would never quote George W. Bush, but I want to end with a George W. Bush quote. He says, too often we judge other groups by their worst example while judging ourselves by our best intentions. And I think so many times in this conflict, we take the worst example of the other side and allow that to define them. And we have to remember there are so many people every day, Israelis and Palestinians, who really just want to take their kids to school without a fear of blowing up, who just want to find somebody to love and spend their days with them. That's what they really want. And yet what we hear all the time is the fired up rhetoric of the extremist veto. And we need to remember that we have some common civil and spiritual basis for living together. And when we go back to that Abraham story, we need to sacrifice our pride, see what's best in each other, and try to navigate a way where those voices become stronger than the extremist vetoes on the outside. So that's our primer. I'll be open for questions afterwards.